Okay, folks, so welcome to Mudit Verma's PhD defense. He's going to be defending his dissertation titled Guidance Priors to Reduce Human Feedback Burden in Sequential Decision Making. The committee consists of Professor Bertsekas, who is on Zoom, Professor Siddharth Srivastava, and Professor Yu Chang, who are here, and I'm the advisor and the chair of the committee. Before we get started, the formal proceedings, I'd like to say just a few words about Mudit. Mudit started his PhD in fall 2019. He joined us directly after his undergrad study, I believe, in Delhi Technical University, where, if I'm not mistaken, he was the gold medalist. Subject to successful defense today, he plans to join as a research scientist at Google AI in their Gemini team. Mudit was a ridiculously young 20-year-old when he joined us. For the first year or so, we had to make sure that he wasn't inadvertently being served alcohol on group outings. That makes him just about 25 now, on the cusp of being a doctor. I keep telling him that it's just way too early to leave academia, but none of them listen to me because I never left. So they think it's better to leave now. Mudit is a gifted coder. Even among a group of very talented coders in my group, he stood out effortlessly. I remember fondly how he helped with the DARPA Ceylon deliverables. He's also great with conceptual art. He's our go-to guy whenever I need some kind of a impressive system diagram. Most of our system diagrams are drawn by him. Perhaps the thing that I'll miss most about Mudit is that he's the quintessential Yochanite. At our group meetings, he's always engaging with what is being presented and asking pointed questions and adding more value to both the speaker and the audience. It's this curiosity about others' work, coupled with him being quite the quick study, makes him a sought-after collaborator. His name appears as co-author on a string of publications that were originally led by other Urchinites, whether it is Sharat Sridharan, Sriram Gopalakrishnan, Zara Zahedi, Lin Guan, or Utkarsh Soni. Mudit has grown to be quite an effective second advisor to junior students, working in this capacity initially with Siddhant Bhamri and more recently with Atharva Gundawar and Upashana Biswas. Here again, I did my best to steer him to the noble, if ill-paid, academic positions because that's where the advising is most appreciated. But Google reaches one out in the end. Maybe once he makes Gemini beat GPT-K and Claude J, he will consider coming back. Mudit has been a great citizen of the lab. He helped us an honorary TA for both the Intro to AI and planning courses over the years, and has, helped in multiple ways in the social life of the lab. All in all, it's been quite a delight having Mudit in our group, and we wish him all the best after this defense. Take it away.
Thank you for the kind words, Professor. So I think I'll start the presentation now. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining in, especially my committee members and all the members in the audience. I don't know how to use it. Maybe I just keep it here.
Oh.
I hope I'm audible, Professor Bertsekas. I'll just stand here.
I remember earlier I was concerned, but now you are.
Okay, I'll be a little louder. Okay. Okay. So today I'll be defending my thesis on guidance priors to reduce human feedback burden in sequential decision making. So AI systems exist in a lot of forms and shapes, from self-driving cars to Atari games to locomotion control, robot manipulation, things like virtual home and household domains, text to video generation, and so on. In this presentation, however, we are interested in sequential decision-making agents which have a human in the loop. So what I really mean is a human is present to either guide the agent or provide their preferences to this agent in order to have a better human-aware AI experience. So typically, AI systems of today need humans, right? They can be very selfish to ask for guidance information shown in red. Things like tips and tricks on how to get by in a certain environment. What are the domain and dynamics information that can help this agent improve, or some kind of commonsensical information that any human could have given. AI agents can also ask for preferences, right? So if they want to be a good human aware AI agent, they would want to align its behaviors to what the human in the loop believes is a good behavior. Right? So they could ask for preferred goals or align themselves for preferred behaviors that they like or avoid behaviors that they dislike. So specifically, reinforcement learning agents face this challenge where alignment with the human in the loop is a big deal. There are also other related areas, not necessarily mutually exclusive in the solutions that are present. Things like reward sparsity, misspecification, feature engineering, and so on are all related and actually are discussed along several areas like RLHF, preference-based RL, reward shaping, inverse RL, and so on. Planning systems also need humans. So challenges to task planning agents would include acquiring mental models of the users, commonsensical information in order to improve the behavior synthesis. That is the goal of such task planning agents. Now, regardless of the kind of feedback that we are getting, the use of this feedback is typically in one of these three buckets by an AI agent. Right? It needs this kind of a user feedback to expedite the learning. So it, again, as I said, it asks for some kind of tips and tricks for how to navigate through the domain and get by. It can try to improve its performance on the objective, or it can also try to align with the human preferences or how they believe the agent should actually behave. Now, this thesis actually takes a multifaceted view of the kind of feedbacks that are being taken from the users. So the first is, of course, their nuanced preferences in green. So this essentially is preferences that are very specific to them. Right? Only the human in the loop knows what is it that they really want out of this agent. Right? So, for instance, in this domain of Montezuma's Revenge, maybe the user wants to play certain kind of level, and based on that, they want the agent to either open this door or some other door and try to navigate to different levels. Right? So there are these preferences that only the users know of. Unfortunately, AI systems, especially in RLHF, have used humans as a crutch, right? Where these feedbacks are actually asked from the user in the loop to request information about commonsensical information, things like, okay, you should avoid opponent or the skull that can hit you and the agent can die and so on, or you should take the shortest route. And so things that are commonsensical, anybody could have provided it, yet the human in the loop is the one who ends up providing this kind of information. Even more problematic is this issue of dynamics and domain information that typically systems like RLHF that are trying to learn tacit behaviors suffer from. So for instance, information like how far is this key from the door, which is very important to open this door, or the fact that a key is required to open this door. So this kind of knowledge is not is required by the agent. Of course, the agent can explore indefinitely and figure it out, but typically a human in the loop is required to come in and guide the agent in order to speed things up. So my argument in this thesis is, in fact, while human in the loop can actually be used for all of these buckets of feedback information, we should actually be looking for alternatives in order to reduce the burden on the human in the loop. The way we do it is by identifying that much of the reason for high sample complexity of these systems is because they end up asking for dynamics and domain information or commonsensical information. And there is a very teeny tiny bit of feedback budget that actually goes into acquiring their individual preferences. Now, if that is the case, then we are better off when we take probably common sense information from some kind of crowdsourced, like some models that are trained through crowdsourced data, like large language models, if they work, or guidance information regarding dynamics and domain from the simulator that the agent already has access to. Right? So rather than pestering the human in the loop, we are more interested in identifying what are these avenues where we can get similar learning signals as to what the human was saying, but through alternative means, which of course is much cheaper and reduces the overall burden on the human in the loop. So in this thesis, I'll be tackling these two buckets. How do we so the main problem with respect to tacit tasks is that they require this tip-centric information about how to get by in the loop, right? And then for that, we'll discuss what are these guidance priors that we can come up with, and can we automate acquisition of those priors in order to, again, reduce the burden on the user. Now, for explicit tasks such as task planning, typically domain model is given. It's already known. The unknown there is what is the mental model of the user, or what are the commonsensical information that the user aligns to, and obtaining that is the second avenue where we explore how well a large language model could be used as a preference proxy. So whenever I mention priors or the word guidance priors, I really mean background knowledge or background knowledge information, but I'm interested in acquiring this kind of an information from an alternative source rather than actually asking the human in the loop. Even if it is an unreliable or slightly less reliable information, I'm much happier rather than actually querying the user in the loop. So to outline this thesis, I have raised this issue that humans are actually being used as a crutch more so rather than using them to impart their individual nuanced preferences, because AI systems are actually seeking information about commonsensical things or dynamics and domain information, for which I propose that we can rather use alternative methods to acquire them anyways. So first, I'll talk about this dynamics and domain information. What exactly do I mean by the guidance priors here, and how do we acquire those in an automated way? Just a quick background on RLHF before I proceed. RLHF, or reinforcement learning from human feedback, follows a similar kind of paradigm as a general RL setup where the rewards are missing. So the way the agent is supposed to realize what the objective is through these human-defined or human-provided feedback information. What are these feedbacks? So typically, predominantly, the kind of feedback that the literature uses is of two kinds. First, and is of the class of binary feedbacks. So the first is absolute feedback, where the human is given that, hey, I'm going to take a move right action. Is this a good action or not? And the user can answer yes or no based on what they think of that action. The second and more general approach that a lot of works are using in these days is comparative feedback. So you provide the user with a pair of trajectories or behaviors and ask the user which one do they find is better in a relative sense, right? And then they provide a binary feedback again on which trajectory or behavior they feel aligns better with their preferences. Now, the way this process unfolds is the agent is responsible for generating a large bank of trajectories. Again, it could be informed, uninformed, and so on. And this can be another research area, but the point is that the agent's responsibility is to generate a bank of trajectories and pick a pair of trajectories to query. Now, the user is responsible for answering which trajectory or behavior they prefer. And this kind of a data set is first collected and is used to learn a reward function. So that is the first objective of this agent that we're talking about, is to learn an approximate reward function that explains the feedback data that is collected from the user. Finally, once you have a reward function, we can treat this as an RL problem where we're just figuring out what is the policy that best optimizes for this learned reward. And typically for tacit tasks, this goes on in a loop. So you do these steps and you repeat. Whereas for other tasks such as RLHF or LLMs, this happens only once. You already collect these trajectories and you just do this process only once. Okay, and how are we learning the reward? It's actually pretty straightforward. We view learning these reward function as a classification problem. We already have labels that trajectory 1 is better than trajectory 2. All we have to do is come up with a reward function that such that the returns for trajectory 1 is better or more than returns of the trajectory 2. Right? So we solve this as a binary classification problem by optimizing cross entropy loss. And in doing so, we end up learning an R that actually explains the feedbacks that we received. Okay, so coming back to what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to learn a reward signal. I'm trying to learn a signal alternate that is an alternative to the human feedback. I need to get, okay, what is this learning signal? How am I going to get it in an automated way? The second challenge is how am I going to inject it during the RL process? And finally, I want to update the policy and make sure all of this holds in place and doesn't fall apart. Very quickly about why a prior or a guidance prior should help. So if you look at these states S0, S1, S2, and the sizes of these bubbles represent the reward values that the agent predicts for these trajectories, such that the sum is anyways the same. The problem that we're trying to solve is this issue of degenerate reward hypothesis space. So any arbitrary, there are infinitely many possible ways of assigning a reward function such that the G that you're looking for is exactly the same. But using this prior can help us eliminate reward assignments along the trajectory for the states, which doesn't seem right or is not generalizable. So this is the kind of prior that we want, right? That eliminates these unreasonable assignments of rewards. Now, I've been saying this word prior a lot, so we can try to dig in as to what this prior actually means in an actual setup. So the first thing that I say is, if we really need a prior, right? If we are talking about some kind of background knowledge that can help an RL agent, why can't we just ask the human in the loop to provide this information? While this is kind of like a little bit of cheating because I'm not really reducing the burden on the human in the loop, but I can at least verify whether having a prior is actually going to help or not. So there's more of a verification that we can perform. So suppose humans can come in and point out why is it that they prefer a certain trajectory? Why is it that they prefer a certain action? And they want to explain their decision by annotating parts of an image observation, and where the annotations mean that these are the relevant regions that I, as the human, believe is what the agent should focus on while taking a certain action. So this is the kind of explanation that we are expecting the humans to provide. And by definition, and the example, for example, in the Montezuma's revenge game, the human is annotating the agent, the stairs that it wants to move to, and then finally the key maybe where it wants to end up going, and so on. So these are the annotations that is an extra information I'm collecting in this specific work. So the idea then is quite straightforward. We have already defined by definition that the annotated regions are quote unquote relevant regions. Therefore, anything that is not annotated is irrelevant. If that is the case, then minor perturbations to these irrelevant regions, like the function that we're trying to learn, should be robust to any of these minor perturbations. Right? So because again, it is irrelevant, at least from the perspective of the human. We operationalize this thought by an auxiliary objective shown on the top right, where we are essentially forcing any function that we are trying to learn to be robust to these perturbations. So we'll take up the state, we'll perturb the irrelevant regions such as Gaussian blurring here, and then we'll make sure that the learning system such as the Q value here or the reward function predicts the same value regardless of these perturbations. Now, a quick intro as to what the subsequent plots might look like. Typically, the y-axis would be the performance of the agent, x-axis would be the number of environment samples that the agent has taken to reach that performance. And finally, since we are asking human feedback in an iterative manner, every once in a while, human is coming in and providing some kind of a feedback. Empirically, what we are interested in is first, is this context-aware prior, which is given by the human, is of any use? And the answer is yes. It actually improves the performance by a lot compared to other ways of data augmentation techniques. And the second thing that we are interested in is our way of using an auxiliary objective to force this prior when we are learning Q values or learning R or the reward function. Is that of any use? Right? And it turns out that is again better than several of the other baselines. But the objective of this work was in fact to identify, is there a pattern to human annotations? Right? Are humans doing something that I can identify and possibly automate whatever they are trying to do? Right? Can Can I do that? And if I can, in that case, I can easily, again, automate that part of the learning signal and then reduce the burden on the human in the loop. There are two main observations that we make as to what the human is doing in that work. The first is, whenever people annotate something, they end up tracking that object over time. So it is possible that maybe there is some aspect of a temporal, some importance of a temporal feature beyond pixel level differences that can actually help in learning a reward function. Now, to that end, I propose this other work wherein we come up with a temporal distance between states and use that as a guidance signal when we are trying to learn the reward function. So coming back to the setup, we have a pair of trajectories. The human is providing a feedback on which trajectory they prefer. We want to learn a reward function that explains the feedback given by the users. And we want to hope that we take much less amount of feedback from the users. To that, we define a term called action distance, which essentially means the expected number of steps the agent has to take under some policy phi from going from a state Si to Sj and come back. What is that expected number of steps, right? And this distance can actually be very helpful for manipulation and locomotion tasks, wherein things like L2 distance may not really be a good heuristic to have. Now, our argument is that if the reward function that we have can preserve this kind of a distance measure in its embedding space, so we are trying to essentially force a specific way of representation learning. So if this reward function can preserve this distance in one of its layers, if you assume RSI as some form of neural network, and if we can preserve this action distance, then we can show empirical boosts in performance. The way to collecting this data is actually very straightforward, even if the method may sound slightly complex. So the agent is already performing several rollouts, right? So we already have access to a bunch of trajectories generated by the agent. What we can do is sample two states in a given trajectory, and the distance between two states, or the number of steps taken to reach from one state to other state, can be put down as an estimate of this action distance, right? Then what we can do is pick an embedding space or one of the layers, which is typically the penultimate layer of this reward function predictor, and force this layer to preserve this action distance by enforcing an L2 norm over it. Right? So we can optimize it using mean squared error, again as an auxiliary object. We find that doing this simple trick, which again has zero cost to the human in the loop, we did not ask for any kind of other kind of feedback information. It was still binary feedback with just this kind of a wrapper over the existing work. We find that we can improve the performance by a large degree. Moreover, this kind of action distance is much better than non-temporal distances such as L2 and other L1 or state-based feature distances. And in fact, this kind of action distance or preserving action distance in the embedding space is very, very helpful. Now we come to the second observation that we make out of our first one. Remember that the human was annotating items, right? But were they annotating every single state? Or were they being selective about what they wanted to highlight or what they wanted the agent to consider while they gave their explanations of their feedback? So it turns out that humans did only select a subset of regions and not the entire frame, right? And this is very useful. We can again use this to our advantage. So I'll ask this. If I show you a behavior, are you looking at each and every frame in order to construct some kind of feedback in your head? Or do you summarize it in some way and then look at those critical states to come up with this feedback? Now, if the latter is the case, which I claim, then at least in the domains where that is possible, then we can use explainable AI techniques. Right? What I'm trying to say is the kind of summary or the criticality of a certain state or how important a certain state is can be obtained by some feature importance measures that are already prevalent in several explainable AI works. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is if you look at this trajectory where the agent is trying to jump to the rope and then maybe land on the other side of the platform. Only certain states are important, such as the point of launch, the point of land. When the agent is in the air, the agent can't really do much, and therefore those states are not really very important to consider. Our hope is, let's say I can give you some kind of state importance measure, right, based on how I feel is what are these important states, and then redistribute the return that I had for this trajectory. So if I can redistribute the goodness or badness of this trajectory only along these critical states, then maybe I'm doing better off than ensuring that I can predict a reasonable reward for each and every single state. Right? So essentially, we want to come up with some kind of state importance measure and make sure that it is only those states which are really important that get the bulk of a credit. So it's essentially some kind of a credit assignment problem in that sense. So as I said, again, this operationalization is pretty straightforward. We already know the goodness of a trajectory because we just predicted it, right? We predicted reward at each step, we can sum it up, and we already know how good or bad a trajectory is as a net sum of goodness or badness. What we want to do is redistribute this goodness into individual states using the state importance measure. But a lot of magic lies in what is the state importance measure, what is the state importance measure, how are we getting it, and whether this redistribution will actually help. So to that end, what we claim is if we are learning a forward dynamics model, which is given this trajectory, if you predict the next state, then in that process, if we can consider what were the states that were very important to do that next state prediction, that can be a proxy for the state importance that we seek. So if we can look at the figure here, the left side of the blue bounding box is already the reward model that we have. We can just sum it up, sum the rewards along a trajectory and get the G or the return of a certain trajectory, which is the net goodness or badness of the trajectory. What we want to do is redistribute this G along the individual states in a more reasonable way. And that reasonable way comes from a world model that we can learn that predicts the next state. And while it does that next state prediction, we can use feature important measures. The one that I use in this work is just look at the attention map across each and every state, and we identify that maybe some states are important. Now, that is, in fact, a proxy task. Once we get that importance, which is alpha, we can redistribute this G according to this alpha and make sure that these are the reward targets that the agent should predict. Again, this L prior is used as an auxiliary objective to solve. What we find is the agent significantly reduces feedback requirements for several locomotion tasks and robot manipulation tasks. A more interesting observation was that the agent is very robust to noisy feedback. So even if the human is making inconsistent feedback, we are more robust to that kind of human feedback. Now, why is it the case? Because we are anchoring our reward learning process to the state importance that we just predicted. So that is one of the reasons we think it's working so well. Okay, so we did a lot of discussion on the bottleneck, that is the absence of dynamics and domain information for these tacit tasks for RLHF systems and how we can acquire some kind of guidance priors for these systems and how we can ultimately improve the performance. For explicit tasks or in AI planning, these models are typically already known. Right? So the challenge is not to get this dynamics or domain information from the human, but rather to identify some commonsensical information that we have to collect from the human in the loop in order to generate or synthesize behaviors that align better with the user. So we'll discuss this in the second part of this thesis, and I'll be considering examples such as the alpha domain, which is getting a lot of popularity these days. It is a household domain where the agent is performing household chores such as picking up objects, eating food items, and so on. There are other domains that we consider along various works, which is the fetch navigation and other kinds of navigation domains. Now, one of the things that I'm proposing is large language models seem to offer a cheap way to collect data. Regardless of whether that data is reliable or unreliable, we can at least agree that it is very cheap to obtain that. Now, the fact that LLMs have been trained on this web corpus or large-scale data, there is some community that at least some faction of people that believe that some kind of commonsensical information is being captured by LLMs. So the question that we want to look at is to explore large language models' ability to provide common sense information or some kind of preference information of the user in the loop, such that we can reduce the interaction with a human in the loop for any downstream task. Okay, so our discussion has been fairly, like large part of our discussion has been about getting binary feedback from the user, right? So we can extend that discussion and say, and discuss this first question, that can LLMs be a preference proxy, which I call when LLMs are answering on behalf of the humans, or a human proxy for preference information. Can LLMs be a preference proxy for desirable plan detection? I'll come to what this plan detection business is. And then we'll also try to test what are the limitations of this preference proxy. When does it stop working? And can we extend our arguments to something beyond LLM reasoning, which it fairly doesn't do as well, to LLM retrieval? So our first question is, suppose that there is a robot who wishes to generate or synthesize behaviors and align it to the users in the loop. Right? So the agent really wants to synthesize those behaviors. Now, big challenge is, who is telling the agent that this behavior is a good behavior or a bad behavior? That's the elephant in the room that the agent has to figure out. It can, of course, ask the human, but that is what we are trying to limit here. The other thing that the agent can do is perform, like employ an LLM and have an internal dialogue with that LLM. So the agent will say, hey, here is a behavior that I think the user may like. Do you agree? And this do you agree is answered by this large language model. So we scout the existing literature and identify that there are some behaviors such as explicable, legible, predictable behavior that typically are preferred by the users. And there is obfuscatory behavior that is not really preferred by the users, right? So we simplify the problem, at least the first problem, to desirable plan detection. What we are asking for is, given a plan, the LLM has to answer, think what a human would think of this robot's behavior. Again, this is kind of a theory of mind objective, where the LLM is answering in the shoes of the human. It doesn't have to think through by itself, but also consider that a human exists in the loop. And we'll come to why that can play, that plays an important role. So to check that, we consider 5 domains, the ones that I showed in the first slide, which is fetch and several navigational domains. And we construct a cross product between those 5 domains and the 4 behavior types, which is explicability, predictability, legibility, and obfuscatory behavior. And we conduct a large-scale user study with several participants to establish that at least whether people agree that a certain behavior is explicable or not, and so on. Right? So first, we establish a baseline that these behaviors are considered to be explicable or a behavior type X, as we claim. Now, next, what we do is we ask the LLM, we give the LLM the proposed plan, some information about the domain, and information about what does explicability mean. And then we'll ask this LLM, please tell me whether this is an explicable behavior or not. It turns out that GPT-4, I won't talk about the one that doesn't really work, but GPT-4, at least, which is the latest model by OpenAI, works really, really well in answering binary questions of whether this plan is of behavior type X. It is very good at these vanilla prompts at any rate. The second question we ask is, given a list of these options that are essentially explanations as to why do you think this plan is of behavior type X, the LLM needs to pick the correct option, the correct explanation as to why does it think that this is of behavior type X. It does really well on that as well. Finally, we ask free-form questions to LLM. Just tell me, why do you think, just explain in free-form sense. And then we do a user study to establish that people also find those explanations plausible. So the question is, right, if the LLM is doing so well, are we done? Because if LLMs can actually reliably do the things that the previous slide said, it is in fact doing theory of mind, and the answer is no. To that end, to show this, we actually conduct some perturbation tests. The first test we conduct is the test of conviction, where if you just perform repeated queries to the LLM, it will give you a different answer, which essentially shows that it is quite unreliable, because a reasoning agent should at least stick to its answer, regardless of whether it is a correct or incorrect answer, because it's following the same process of justification of its answers. The second test we consider is the inconsistent belief test, and amongst the sort of three, this closely tries to test this theory of mind ability. So what we show to the agent is this blurry video on the context that probably the video feed was corrupted in transit and human is looking at this blurry video of the robot. Now the LLM has to answer whether the robot is trying to go left or right. It turns out that any human would just say, I can't really answer because I can't see the video. Now LLM fails to be in the shoes of the human and just goes on to answering some kind of a behavior type for even these kinds of corrupted videos. Finally, we also have this third test called uninformative context test, where we include some kind of uninformative context. Probably we'll give away the answer as part of the prompt, but we'll say that even if the answer is written on that sheet of paper stuck on top of the head of the robot, the human cannot read it. So LLM knows the answer because it exists in the prompt, but it has to think through the shoes of the human and realize that the fact that the font is so small and human cannot read that information means that human will be using the behavior in the video rather than what is written on the sheet of paper. And LLM, of course, fails all of these tests miserably. So while LLMs have a better than chance performance to be a preference proxy, as shown in the previous set of experiments, there is some need of exercising caution when we want to deploy LLMs as a preference proxy, because it is susceptible to trivial perturbations. Okay, now the second question we want to ask, okay, if you are very optimistic about my previous argument that LLMs are indeed a preference proxy, a next question becomes, if LLMs can generate these preferences, why can't it just convert it into plans and give me plan guidance? After all, if LLMs can give me this kind of a plan information, I'm really happy because I can just use it for my downstream tasks. But the question is to test the limits of our claim whether LLMs can act as a preference proxy even for plan generation beyond plan detection, which was in the previous work. So the argument made by a recent work called React is exactly what I'm trying to refute. So they propose that if only LLMs have access to some kind of guidance information given by the users, then magic will happen and things will go all in place and we'll be able to get or improve results in planning. Now, the way they do this is they have this notion of thought, which essentially means the guidance information given by the user. And this thought contains some kind of high-level description of what the agent should do next. Right? So the human is giving this as part of the examples. They claim that if that thought is present during the execution in the life of the agent, then LLMs are better planners. What I want to refute is, I really like the idea that LLMs can act as a preference proxy, but there is a difference between acting as a preference proxy and the ability to operationalize those preferences into actual plans, which are executable. Just as a quick background on exploring large language models for plan generation, which is the React work that we are trying to dissect here. What React does is work in this alpha domain, which is a household domain where the robot is supposed to do some household chores, and they'll provide some instructions as to what the agent is doing, what are the different objects in the household environment, and so on. And they make two critical claims that we'll try to study. The first is they have this idea that this guidance information must be given in a piecewise manner. Right? So somehow they believe that if only I can provide the guidance about the future in a piecewise manner during the execution trace, the performance of the agent is going to go up. The second claim they make is, what is the content of this guidance information? They say that if we give information about the future of what the agent is supposed to do, then the agent is going to do much better. So we'll try to investigate along these two claims specifically. The final thing I want to mention is how React works. Is React assumes access to two examples and the actual query. For instance, you need to put some object in some location, And the tricky thing that is somewhere in the appendix is that all of these examples belong to the same task as the query. This will come in handy when we try to figure out why is React actually working. Now, in order to dissect the first claim, which is that the presence of this thing tag or guidance information during the execution trace is of any importance, what we do is a very simple experiment. We collate or collect all of these piecewise guidance information and provide the agent to it in an upfront manner. So at the very beginning, the agent already has access to what is it supposed to do, right? And what happens is, so whenever you see base, it is the React performance that we obtain in our experiments along various models. And the other columns are the variations that we attempt. COT refers to chain of thought, and anonymized COT refers to where we anonymize certain object names to generic object terms. It turns out that just the fact that we collated all of this thing tag or guidance information in one place and gave it to the agent upfront is actually improving performance, which is very counterintuitive if we already have accepted the claims of React. And with this very simple experiment really shows that presence of thing tag during the step-by-step execution is not really doing any wonders. The second question that we want to ask, or the second claim that we want to dissect in the React paper, is this notion that guidance information must be about the future or whatever the agent has to do next. Now, what we do is, again, we construct counterfactual variations to this. The first variation is we can just, instead of talking about the future, we can talk about the past, right? So what are the past failures? What are the past actions that were not as great, or so on? Secondly, and this is even more bizarre, is we can just talk about the content of the guidance information to be irrelevant, like to be independent of the task at hand. For instance, we'll just say, take a deep breath, work on this problem step by step, and so on. That has nothing really to do either with the foresight or hindsight information regarding the task that we're trying to solve. Now, if you truly believe the claims of the original React paper, then any of these variations should have really crippled the performance of React. What ends up happening is we are, if anything, doing better than the base React. But one observation, again, so this already disproves the fact that content of this guidance information has anything to do really with the final planning performance. What I'm more interested in is, even after all these variations, right, why hasn't the performance gone down? Why is it still 30% is no joke, right? Every third plan out of 10 plans is correct. So what is really happening? Why is React performance is 50%, 30%, and so on? It is still a sizable number. So for completeness, we argue and claim that in trying to understand what is really happening, is this business with what kind of examples are being given to the React agent. So as I said in the beginning, the React paper assumes that both of the examples belong to the same task, such as heat the object, put something, pick something, and so on, as the query. It turns out that if you create other variations, the two important ones that I'll talk about is if both of the examples are of a different task, and if one of the examples is of a different task, then what happens? It turns out that we can successfully bring down the performance to single digits with these variations. Right? Now, at least we know that there is something going on magical about the example that we're giving. Now, you may ask, right, naturally, why am I giving these different tasks as the examples to a query which is of a different task? So what is really happening is that all of these tasks actually share a lot of actions anyways. For instance, one task could be heat a certain object, which subsumes a certain other task, such as pick a certain object. So for heating something, you have to anyways pick it up. So a lot of these tasks anyways share a lot of actions. Right? So the fact that I'm giving examples of a different task shouldn't really be hampering the agent's performance. The second thing is, for instance, suppose I've given the example of a heat task, which anyways involves picking up an object, and the query is to pick that object. Even then, LLMs really fail to attain any useful performance or any meaningful performance. So eventually what we have shown is React is not really useless, but it only works when you have instance specific examples available to you, right? But the sad part is that this is not really scalable, and maybe in certain situations where you have a large bank of data pool and you can curate some kind of instance specific examples, maybe React is useful, and this argument is made by works like AutoCOT, which perform some kind of clustering in the space of examples that we have to get better, to provide better examples to the LLM and claim that there is some units of improvement in LLM reasoning. But our arguments actually support that LLMs are not really reasoning, but retrieving, which is why there is a large part of performance is dependent on the nature and task of the examples given to the LLMs. Finally, I want to highlight that just because LLMs can produce preferences, which is still unreliable to some degree, but just because LLMs can produce preferences doesn't really mean that it can operationalize it into actual executable plans. So this is very important to understand the limitations of assuming LLM as a preference proxy. Finally, we move on to explore more of LLM retrieval ability, where we extend our argument of LLMs as a preference proxy, but for extracting domain abstractions. So previously, we were actually more interested in some kind of comment that the LLM can provide about plans. The other way of taking some kind of information from LLMs is to obtain abstractions that a user agrees to. For instance, we can again consider this alpha domain where there are several primitive actions available to the agent, such as picking and eating and walking around and so on, given in the yellow bubbles. So typically these primitive actions comes packaged with a robot. So there's not really much need of figuring out what these primitive actions are. What is missing in terms with respect to a user in the loop is what are these abstract tasks that the user believes is useful? What are the decompositions of those abstract tasks that the user feels is useful for the task that this agent is going to do? And the thing is that you would need domain experts to come in and provide this kind of an abstraction and related decomposition to help the agent. So again, we want to extend our argument of large language models as a preference proxy in our attempt to obtain this kind of abstract task and decomposition structure. So for instance, users can align themselves to a decomposition structure such as the one on the slides, where the red bubbles are these abstract tasks which the agent cannot really do directly, but these tasks can be reduced to primitive operators that can execute these high-level tasks. Now, our objective is to use large language models to obtain what are these abstract tasks, what is the decomposition structure, and again, try to get this in a formal syntax that can be used by a downstream planning agent. Now, what we really need in this question that I raised is these red bubbles, right? Because again, these red bubbles are being given otherwise by a domain expert whose time we want to save. Now, direct generation of HDDL, which is a hierarchical domain definition language, which captures these kinds of hierarchies as well as the primitive operators, direct generation of this kind of a program. So if I just ask the LLM, hey, here is my domain, please generate an HDDL such that these operators are present. There are actually several issues. One of the foremost issues is inability to operationalize syntax, inability to generate preferred decompositions, and there is this issue of when the user wants to perform any kind of manipulation or changes to the proposed LLM output, it becomes very difficult because of cascaded changes. If you change one thing, you may want to edit others, and that is something LLM is not able to do. To solve that, what we do is we take a two-phase approach, as shown here, where in the first phase, in the green part, we want to generate a decomposition tree as we saw in the previous slides. Right? A high-level tree that proposes abstract tasks and attempts to decompose it into these primitive operators. Now, here, the nice thing that we're trying to do is decouple preference specification with translation. So in the first phase, which is green phase, the users have already specified the nature of decomposition. Now, all there is left to do is convert this decomposition tree, which lacks preconditions, lacks specification of the kind of parameters it can take and so on, and lacks formal semantics and so on. So we can decouple that part from preference specification and have a separate phase that takes in this decomposition tree and converts it into the syntax that we want, which is the HDDL syntax. So, and all of this we had to do to decouple preference specification with LLM acting as a translator, which we already know that there are enough reasons to believe translation abilities of LLM is quite reliable. And finally, if we have this kind of an HDDL program, we can feed it to an HTN planner or hierarchical planner to solve for valid problem files. So the way we do this is, as I said, we will construct a prompt with some kind of task information, such as, hey, this is a domain about a household environment and so on. We'll provide the primitive actions that are available to the agent. And what we really need out of LLM is a lifted HTN or the decomposition tree. Again, that tree lacks ordering of the subtasks. It lacks formal semantics. It lacks the parameters each of those tasks can take and so on. But it does provide some structure to the preference or the kind of abstractions that the user align themselves to. The way we can do this is the user in the loop is present more so in a constructive role. Now, by constructive role, what I mean is that users can come in and suggest alternative ways of decomposing something. They can suggest or request several ways of decomposing a specific task and so on. And furthermore, LLMs can make use of automated critics, such as critics that can check for whether this decomposition tree is in fact a tree, not a graph. It doesn't have cycles. There are no parsing errors. We can make sure that these tasks are used in a consistent manner, the nomenclature is correct, and so on. So the things that can be automated can be part of the bank of automated critiques that can let the LLM know that there are these issues and doesn't require a human to provide those kinds of feedback. So in this phase, the human assumes more of a constructive role in order to come up with this kind of a lifted HTN. Specifically, we want after this phase, the LLM and the human to agree to this kind of a decomposition tree. In fact, the tree that you've been seeing from the first slide is generated by GPT-4 for the alpha domain. Now, the second phase is to ground this tree into an HDDL syntax. As I said, this is more of a translation problem. However, it still requires some kind of generation. For instance, LLM has to figure out what preconditions must be for these tasks, what are the subtask orderings for these tasks, and so on. Now here, a human in the loop can still be present, but assume more of a corrective role, because human can come in and point out the mistakes that the agent is doing. So they'll say that, hey, if you look at this generation of syntax, it is not really right, or it is missing in the first place. Again, as before, the LLM can use a bank of automated critics, which again check for parsing errors and other errors that can come in when we are generating this syntax. So finally, this syntax would look something like this, but this is just a few of those methods. In the alpha domain, the number of methods can easily span from 25 to 30, which is a large piece of code that has to be generated by the LLM. So eventually what we find is, while GPT 3.5 struggles with generating correct format outputs, GPT-4, however, can produce these HDDL domains and satisfactory lifted HTN or the lifted decomposition trees in some reasonable number of iterations. Specifically, in the first table, you see that human is providing more of a constructive role where they provide suggestions or provide inputs. Whereas in the second phase of HDDL generation, they assume more of a corrective role where they point out mistakes instead of providing useful suggestions. You also test with respect to whether users can actually manipulate these lifted HTNs. One of the points I want to make is whatever the LLM generates may not be actually, may seem to be correct, but may not exactly align with the users in the loop. in that event, we would want LLM to be able to follow instructions of manipulation, such as I want this method, I want more decomposition structures, and so on. Now we test for some kinds of manipulation abilities, such as changing the nomenclature, suggesting more methods, adding a given method, and so on. And it turns out that at least GPT-4 is quite decent in doing that. So finally, this work actually decouples preference specification from the translation ability of LLMs to generate HDDL that captures the abstract tasks and the decomposition structure that a human would agree to. Because the human exists in the loop during the lifted HTN phase, we have simplified their life because they can provide quick changes and quickly visualize the kind of decomposition structure that is available. And finally, they can also manipulate both the lifted HTN, such as changing nomenclature and suggested methods and request additional methods, and so on. So finally, we have talked about the ability of large language models to act as a preference proxy, and what are the limitations of when we assume such a role for an LLM. Specifically, while LLMs can be somewhat of a preference proxy for desirable plan detection, they actually don't really do well at all for plan generation, which could have been much better guidance, but unfortunately, LLMs are not able to do that. However, as it can do desirable plan detection, we also extend the argument towards extracting abstractions that are aligned to the user in the loop, and users can actually come into the loop of the LLM generation and fix mistakes if it makes any. Okay, so in conclusion, what I've talked about is this use of humans as more of a crutch rather than to take their preferences in the name of collecting feedback from them. We have taken a multifaceted view of what are these kinds of pieces of feedback that could have been obtained via some kind of an alternative source. Specifically, a main bottleneck for tacit tasks or manipulation and robot locomotion tasks is the absence of dynamics and domain information. We looked at what are the guidance priors that can be useful, how do we get it in an automated fashion, and how do we inject it during the RLHF or reward learning phase. Now, for the explicit tasks, such as those that we looked at a while back, the main challenge is to obtain commonsensical information that can be useful for behavior synthesis. And we looked at what would be the role of large language models as a preference proxy for desirable plan detection, its limitation in plan generation, and extend our argument to generating abstract tasks and decomposition structure that aligns well with the users. Okay. Finally, I want to thank my committee members, Professor Butchekes, Professor Srivastava, and Professor Zhang, for their time and efforts and comments and questions. Of course, this thesis is pretty much incomplete without the guidance and advice of Professor Rao. And I think I've been very privileged and spoiled with the senior members and the current members of my lab. And I feel really fortunate to have worked with them. And I would like to conclude my presentation with this kind of conclusion slide.